So it's the 1500s, and you've just been accused of witchcraft. Maybe you're surprised, maybe you're not, because honestly, given the way things worked back then, it was really only a matter of time. The evidence against you? Your cat looked at someone wrong. Your beer tasted too good. You had a mole on your shoulder that the local witch hunter found philosophically troubling. These are not jokes. These are the kinds of things that got people dragged before courts, dunked in rivers, and burned at the stake. Here are 10 reasons you would have been burned as a witch. Birthmarks. Picture yourself in a small village somewhere in 16th century England. You have got a mole on your collarbone, maybe a reddish patch behind your left ear. Something you were born with, something you have had your entire life and never thought twice about. Your neighbor Agnes has now thought about it approximately 17 times this week, and she has been talking. The belief, widely held and enthusiastically enforced by professional witch hunters across Europe, was that the devil physically marked his followers when he brought them on board. A skin-colored spot, a small lump, a raised patch of unusual texture. These were called the devil's mark, and finding one on your body was considered hard evidence of a personal arrangement with Satan. Here is where it gets elegant in its unfairness. The examiners who came to inspect you were not just looking for marks. They were testing them. The theory went that a devil's mark would be numbed by dark magic. No pain, no bleeding. So they brought a long needle and jabbed the suspicious spot to check if you reacted. No flinch. Guilty. You did flinch. Some argued you were clearly performing, and some of the needle testing instruments of the period were built with retractable blades, needles that appeared to go in but did not, ensuring the examiner could produce a clean, pain-free result whenever the occasion required it. You could have been born with perfectly ordinary skin and still walked out of that room with a conviction. Solid process. Being too good at your job. Let's say you are Margaret. Margaret makes ale. Margaret has always made ale. Margaret's ale is, by every account in the village, exceptional, smooth, consistent, never goes off, never tastes like someone brewed it in a ditch, which puts it comfortably ahead of most of the local competition. People travel from 2 villages over specifically for Margaret's ale. This is the problem. In a world without microbiology, without any working understanding of fermentation, yeast activity, or temperature control, there is no convenient explanation for why Margaret's ale is so good and Thomas's ale tastes like regret and standing water. The conclusion reached by several of Margaret's neighbors. She was doing something to it, chanting over the pot, whispering to the grain, running some kind of quiet ritual between the stirring and the bottling. Here is the part that should make everyone feel a little embarrassed in retrospect. The standard setup of a medieval brewery, a large pot, a long wooden stirring stick, possibly a cat wandering around keeping the mice out of the barley, mapped almost perfectly onto the visual vocabulary the era had already assigned to witches. Large cauldron, check. Stick long enough to pass for a broomstick, check. Cat, obviously and emphatically check. Margaret was not doing anything unusual. Margaret had learned through accumulated practice how to manage heat and minimize contamination. But accumulated practice producing ideal fermentation conditions was not a concept anyone in the village had ready access to. Witchcraft was right there, and it was free. Being slightly unusual, meet old Eleanor. Eleanor lives at the edge of the village in a house that has seen better decades. She knows an uncomfortable amount about plants. Which ones bring down a fever, which ones settle a stomach, which ones will kill you and should not be eaten under any circumstances. She talks to herself occasionally. She has firm opinions about the weather that she shares with no one in particular. She does not come to the market much. Her cat has a name that the village children find difficult to say without lowering their voices. Eleanor is, in the collective assessment of the village, suspicious. Not because she has done anything specific, because she exists in a way that does not map onto anything familiar, and in small communities organized around conformity and close observation, That gap was its own kind of problem. The knowledge she practiced, the plant remedies, the small rituals, the practical advice she gave to people dealing with sick livestock or difficult childbirths, was the same tradition the village had quietly relied on for generations. Helpful when it worked. When it did not, the accounting shifted fast. If Eleanor's remedy helped your cow recover, you thanked her and went home. If the cow died anyway, if the harvest came in thin, if your child did not improve, Eleanor was no longer a practical woman with extensive plant knowledge. Eleanor was the explanation. Getting from local resource to formal accusation required nothing more than one bad season and one neighbor willing to say her name to the right person. Trial by water. So at this point you might be thinking, fine, but surely there was some kind of formal process, a trial, some mechanism by which the accused could actually demonstrate their innocence before anything irreversible happened. And yes, there was a process. It was called trial by water, sometimes swimming the witch, and it worked as follows. They bound your right thumb to your left big toe and your left thumb to your right big toe, and they placed you into a body of water in front of the assembled village. If you sank, innocent. If you floated, witch. The logic behind this, presented with complete seriousness by those who endorsed it, was that water, as a sacred element linked to Christian baptism, would reject the body of someone who had given their soul to the devil. This was not fringe behavior carried out by a few over-enthusiastic villagers. It had formal institutional support. It appeared in legal and theological texts. King James I of England, who wrote an entire book about witchcraft called Daemonologie and took the subject extremely seriously, was a documented and enthusiastic backer of the swimming test. Written instructions existed for how to conduct it correctly and consistently. There were documented cases across England, Scotland, and the Netherlands, stretching from the early 1500s well into the 1700s. The test, in other words, was not an accident of mob hysteria. It was procedure. The no-win structure of the swimming test deserves a moment of proper appreciation. If you sank, the village retrieved your body and noted with some relief that you had been innocent all along. If you floated, they pulled you out and proceeded with the witchcraft conviction. There was no outcome in which you walked away dry and cleared. The test had one function, to produce a witch. Sinking proved innocence in the same way that being dead proved you had not been dangerous. Technically accurate, not particularly useful. Some accounts suggest that the ropes used to bind the accused were held by examiners standing at the waterside, which meant the result could be influenced before the suspect even hit the water. The whole mechanism was less a test than a ceremony with a predetermined guest of honor. Bad weather. Imagine your name is Thomas. Thomas is a perfectly ordinary farmer in rural Germany in 1590 who has not done anything interesting in his entire life. Then it hails. The hail is bad, it flattens crops, ruins the harvest, and leaves half the village facing a winter with significantly less food than planned. Someone needs to be responsible for this. The sky is not a person you can put on trial, which is inconvenient, but Thomas has been looking a bit off lately, and his wife's cousin's neighbor mentioned something once, and here we are. The belief that witches could manipulate weather was not a fringe position. It was written into the Malleus Maleficarum, the 15th century manual that became something like the standard reference text for witch prosecution across large parts of Europe. Weather working was listed alongside flight and nocturnal gatherings as a documented witch behavior. Hailstorms, droughts, frosts arriving too early, floods coming from the wrong direction. All of these were potential evidence. The real explanation for why weather was unpredictable and occasionally catastrophic in 16th century rural Europe was, of course, that weather is unpredictable and occasionally catastrophic. Thomas did not make it hail. Thomas had a bad week and lived near people who needed a reason. Being named by someone else. Here is the cleanest entry on this list, and also somehow the most maddening. You could end up accused of witchcraft because someone who was already accused of witchcraft said your name. Once the formal machinery of a witch trial got moving, Examiners routinely asked the accused to name their associates, other members of their supposed coven, other individuals they had seen at nocturnal gatherings, other people they knew to be in similar arrangements with the devil. The accused, under conditions ranging from sustained psychological pressure to formal torture, named people. Sometimes they named enemies. Sometimes they named strangers. Sometimes, under enough pressure, they named anyone they could think of whose name would make the questioning stop for a few hours. Confession extracted this way spread outward like a very deliberate version of a chain letter nobody wanted to receive, and the person whose name got mentioned had approximately the same recourse as everyone else caught in the system. Not much. Being named was often treated as preliminary evidence in itself. The accusation validated the investigation. The investigation generated more accusations. The math here was not subtle, and nobody designing the system appears to have been troubled by it. Being a successful merchant. Consider a man named Heinrich who lives in a prosperous trading town in the early 1600s and runs a cloth business that is doing, by any reasonable measure, extremely well. Heinrich's bolts of fabric are always the right weight. His dyes hold. His prices are competitive. His clients come back. Meanwhile, the cloth merchant across the square, Georg, who has been at this for 30 years, is having an increasingly difficult time explaining to his own clients why Heinrich's operation keeps outperforming his. Georg does not have a theory that involves sourcing relationships, supply chain management, or superior negotiating habits with dyers further upstream. Georg is working with a different and more immediately satisfying set of explanatory tools. The idea that unusual commercial success pointed towards supernatural assistance was not limited to food and drink production. It applied broadly to any trade where outcomes varied significantly between practitioners, and the variance was difficult to account for through visible effort alone. Cloth merchants, tanners, metal workers, millers, anyone whose work involved processes that were partly opaque to outside observation was a potential candidate. The miller whose grain ground consistently fine while everyone else's came out coarse. The tanner whose leather lasted through 3 winters while competitors cracked in the first cold snap. Success that looked consistent and unexplained was, in the reasoning framework available to people working without chemistry or material science, a reasonable thing to find suspicious. Heinrich had very likely just figured out where to source better raw materials, and had spent a decade refining a process nobody could see him doing. Georg was not going to arrive at that conclusion on his own. Livestock, acting strange. Your neighbor Peter has a pig. Peter's pig, by every prior account, was a perfectly ordinary pig. Ate what pigs eat, did what pigs do, had no remarkable opinions about anything. Then one morning, the pig refuses to eat. 2 days later, it runs in tight circles for 20 minutes, and then stops and stares at the fence for an extended period that Peter finds personally unsettling. 3 days after that, one of his cows stops producing milk at the usual rate. Peter has a theory, and it does not involve parasites, nutritional deficiency, or the entirely plausible possibility that pigs sometimes just have difficult weeks. It involves you. The idea that witches could transfer illness and misfortune to livestock was embedded deep in the popular imagination of early modern Europe. Animals were valuable. In a subsistence economy, losing a cow or a pig was not an inconvenience. It was a crisis. And animal health was erratic and poorly understood, which meant unpredictable losses needed explanations that pointed somewhere specific. Sudden changes in behavior, drops in milk production, livestock dying without obvious physical cause, all of these were regularly attributed to magical interference from an identifiable neighbor. Trial records from 1590s Scotland include detailed testimony about cattle behaving oddly in the proximity of a particular woman in the weeks before they fell sick. That woman was subsequently convicted. The pig almost certainly had intestinal worms, which is a condition that has been causing pigs to behave erratically and refuse feed for considerably longer than the witch trials existed. The cow had a mild infection that was affecting production. Peter did not know about either of these things. Word of the accusation reached the village council by Thursday. An examiner happened to be traveling through the following week, which was, from Peter's perspective, excellent timing. How confessions worked. Here is something worth understanding about the witch trial as a machine rather than an isolated event. It did not require evidence to get started. It required an accusation. Once an accusation existed, the investigation could proceed, and the investigation was designed to produce a confession, because a signed or witnessed confession made everything official, final, and difficult to revisit at a later date. The problem, if you were on the receiving end, was that the methods used to extract confessions were effective at extracting confessions regardless of whether the person confessing had done anything. Sleep deprivation was common and formally sanctioned in many jurisdictions. Extended interrogation stretched across multiple consecutive days without rest. In some regions, strappado, suspension by the wrists bound behind the back, was a legally authorized part of the examination process, available in graduated stages depending on how cooperative the accused was being. Under these conditions, people said what they needed to say to make the questioning stop. They confessed to gatherings they had never attended, to rituals they had never performed, to pacts they had never signed, and to accomplices they had invented in the moment. Then, because confessions routinely included a formal demand to name other participants, the next round of arrests followed directly from the last batch of confessions. In Bamberg, Germany, between 1626 and 1631, roughly 300 people were tried and executed for witchcraft in a single sustained panic. The names came from confessions. The confessions came from the previous round of trials. The trials fed themselves in a loop that required no actual witches to function at any stage, which is, in retrospect, the most efficient possible summary of how it worked. Tripping in public. And then there is this one, and it is almost too mundane to end on, which is precisely why it belongs here. You are walking through the market in a small English village sometime in the 1640s. You stumble slightly on an uneven cobblestone. It is an uneven cobblestone. They are all uneven. The entire street is a collection of trip hazards held together by ambition and centuries of deferred maintenance. You catch yourself. You keep walking. You think nothing of it. Widow Agnes, however, saw you stumble, and Widow Agnes has been keeping a mental inventory since last February, when your cat knocked over her fence post and you were very slow to apologize, and the stumble goes on the list next to the fence post incident. The folk belief that witches could not move freely through spaces considered sacred or communally significant had variants that included difficulty walking normally through the center of town, stumbling near a church entrance, or appearing to lose coordination at moments coinciding with prayer times or holy observances. In parts of Germany and the Swiss Confederacy, this extended to appearing unsteady during religious processions. The specific behaviors that counted as suspicious varied by region and by decade, shaped by what the community already found strange about the person under observation, which tells you something about how the whole system processed information. This was not a codified legal standard the way the swimming test was. It was softer, more neighborhood level, and rarely the kind of thing that appeared formally in an indictment on its own. But neighborhood-level suspicion was consistently where formal accusations started. The real point of this one is not that stumbling in public was evidence of witchcraft. The real point is that in a small community where observation was constant and the explanatory tools available were limited to the supernatural, almost any behavior could become evidence. The cobblestone was just the occasion. Widow Agnes's February had done the actual work. That is the thing about being in a small community in the 16th century with a suspicious neighbor and an explanatory framework that required someone to blame. The evidence did not need to be solid. It just needed to be there when someone went looking for it. That is all for today. If you want more videos on the parts of history nobody puts in the textbooks, subscribe. There is plenty more where this came from.